Every great magic trick begins with the mundane. It starts with the ordinary, the expected, the things we have seen 1,000 times before. On that Tuesday night in 2025, the arena felt exactly like that. Ordinary. The air conditioning hummed its steady mechanical rhythm, battling the heat of 15,000 bodies. The scent of popcorn and stale beer hung heavy in the air, a familiar perfume to anyone who calls themselves a wrestling fan. But there was a lull.
Ow!
You know that specific feeling in the middle of a show? The main event is still an hour away, the undercard is wrapping up, and the crowd is settling into a comfortable, almost sleepy rhythm. They were checking their phones. They were taking photos of the empty ramp. They were talking about dinner. This is the canvas upon which history is painted. Producers in the back know this. They know that to create a moment of absolute heart-stopping shock, you first have to lower the guard of the audience. You have to make them feel safe in the predictability of the show. The ring ropes were tightened. The canvas swept clean during a commercial break. The lights were dimmed to a standard blue hue, signaling a standard segment was coming up next. There was zero electricity in the room, just a dull, buzzing anticipation for the next scheduled match. Nobody looked at the entrance stage with intent. Nobody held their breath. The internet was silent. The dirt sheets had reported nothing but routine contract negotiations and minor injuries. The world was asleep at the wheel, completely unaware that the car was about to veer off the cliff. It was the perfect silence. It's the kind of silence that, in hindsight, feels heavy with secrets. It's the kind of silence that screams before it breaks. Then, the shift happened. It wasn't a sound at first. It was a feeling. Physical vibration that started in the floorboards and traveled up through the soles of 15,000 pairs of shoes. The giant LED screens, which usually flash bright logos and motion graphics, suddenly went pitch black. Not the technical difficulty black, but a deliberate, suffocating void. The arena lights cut out a split second later, total darkness. For 3 seconds, the only sound was the confused murmur of the crowd, a rising tide of what's going on. And is this part of the show? Then the sound hit. It wasn't the music we remembered. It was a distorted, digitized version of a melody that had been buried for years. A single spotlight snapped on, hitting the center of the stage, and there she stood. But she didn't look like the person who left. The colorful gear was gone. The smile that used to play to the crowd was erased. She was clad in chrome and matte black, a futuristic armor that looked more like cinema than sport. She stood perfectly still, head bowed, letting the recognition wash over the crowd like a tidal wave. The realization hit the audience in distinct ripples. First, the diehards in the front row, whose screams were primal. Then, the realization traveled up to the nosebleeds. The noise wasn't a cheer. It was a roar of disbelief. It was the sound of 15,000 people losing their minds simultaneously. This wasn't just a return. It was a reinvention. The atmosphere snapped from boredom to hysteria in the blink of an eye. The camera shook, not from special effects, but from the sheer acoustic force of the crowd, realizing that the impossible had just walked through the curtain. While the fans were losing themselves in the euphoria of the return, a different drama was unfolding inside the squared circle. The camera cut to the champion standing in the ring, the woman who had been dominating the division for the last year. Usually in wrestling, the opponent reacts with anger or performative shock. They shake their fists. They yell at the referee.
What?
But this was different. This reaction felt uncomfortably real.
What?
The champion simply froze. Her arms dropped to her sides. The championship belt, usually held high like a weapon, hung loosely in her grip, almost forgotten. You could see the color drain from her face, visible even under the harsh ring lights. It was a moment of genuine vulnerability that you rarely see in scripted entertainment. The script had been thrown out the window. She looked toward the entrance ramp, not as a competitor, but as a ghost witness. The referee, usually the invisible man in the ring, was caught on a hot mic asking, "Is this? Are we clear on this?" The confusion was palpable. This return shattered the suspended disbelief because the people in the show looked just as surprised as the people watching it. The champion backed up, retreating until her back hit the turnbuckles. It was a subtle, instinctual move of self-preservation. The returning legend didn't run to the ring. She didn't pose. She walked with a slow, predatory cadence, her eyes locked on the champion.
Ow!
The air in the ring became thick, suffocating. The commentary team stopped speaking entirely for a full 10 seconds, letting the visual tell the story. The silence from the announcers amplified the tension, confirming that the hierarchy of power hadn't just shifted, it had been completely dismantled in real time. If the scene in the ring was tense, the scene backstage was a beautiful, chaotic symphony. Imagine the gorilla position, the nerve center of the show, just behind the entrance curtain. Usually, this area is controlled chaos, full of producers with headsets, barking timings and cues. But in this moment, reports say it was dead silent, followed by an explosion of movement. Writers were scrambling for scripts that no longer mattered. Entire rundown for the next 3 months of television had just been incinerated by one entrance theme. You heard stories later of cameramen sprinting down hallways, trying to get the perfect angle of her walk, tripping over cables because nobody had prepared for this shot. The most telling detail, however, was the reaction of the other wrestlers. Usually, the locker room watches the monitors with a detached, professional interest. They analyze the work, they critique the moves. Not tonight. Tonight, they were fans again. Legends and rookies alike huddled around the small monitors, mouths agape. There's a specific kind of respect in the wrestling business that isn't spoken. It is shown in how people stop what they are doing. Laundry was dropped. Tape was left unspooled. The locker room realized that their spots, their storylines, and their screen time were suddenly in jeopardy. The queen had returned to the chessboard, and every pawn was suddenly aware of their vulnerability. The chaos wasn't just about excitement, it was about survival. The hierarchy of the backstage politics had been appended without a single meeting. The returning star walked past them all without a word, a phantom passing through a room of living, breathing people who suddenly felt very, very small. The backstage area was no longer a workplace. It was the scene of an upheaval. In the modern era, secrets are obsolete. We live in a world of leaks, insiders, Reddit threads, and paparazzi who tracked flights. If a wrestler sneezes in an airport, the internet knows about it before they land. That is what made this moment so terrifyingly impressive. There were no leaks. No grainy photos of her at the airport, no insider reports hinting at a mystery partner. The digital silence leading up to this event was a masterclass in counterintelligence. How do you hide one of the most famous women in the world in 2025? You don't hide her? You change the narrative so completely that nobody's even looking for her. The social media explosion that followed was unprecedented. Within 3 minutes of her music hitting, her name wasn't just trending, it was the only thing being discussed. Twitter, or X, crashed for users in 3 different countries. Sheer volume of data videos, GIFs, reaction shots flooded the servers, but amidst the hype, a question began to form in the collective mind of the internet. How? Fans became detectives, scrubbing through old interviews, looking for clues they missed. They analyzed her Instagram posts from weeks ago, realizing that the vacation photos were likely staged decoys. The realization that they had been worked, that they had been successfully lied to in an age where truth is a commodity, created a sense of delight. We love being fooled when the trick is good. The lack of spoilers meant the emotion was pure, unfiltered shock. It reminded everyone why they fell in love with this theater in the first place. The digital world, usually so cynical and in the know, was humbled. They were forced to admit that they didn't know everything, and that mystery was still alive. Once the shock subsided, the analysis began. The internet didn't just talk about that she was back, they obsessed over how she looked. This wasn't a nostalgia run. This wasn't a greatest hits tour, where she wore her old gear and did her old catchphrases. This was an evolution. The visual storytelling was precise and deliberate. Her gear, that matte black, futuristic armor, spoke of a hardened warrior, not a returning hero. It suggested that wherever she had been fighting. It wasn't sparkly, it was industrial. It was designed for war, not for merchandise sales. Video essayists and wrestling bloggers immediately began dissecting the symbolism. They noted the lack of color, interpreting it as a rejection of her past colorful character. They slowed down the footage of her walk, noting that she didn't slap hands with the fans. She didn't smile. She walked with a military efficiency. This deadly attitude wasn't about being a villain. It was about being focused. It terrified the fan base in the best way possible. They realized that the character they loved was gone, replaced by something more dangerous. The narrative shifted from she's back to what is she going to do to us. The futuristic aesthetic suggested she was here to drag the division into a new era, kicking and screaming if necessary. It was a visual declaration that the past was dead. She wasn't here to relive the glory days. She was here to end them. This scrutiny of her appearance added layers to the story before a single match was even wrestled. The costume was the promo. The look was the threat. We often forget that beneath the armor and the character, there is a human being whose heart is racing at 180 beats per minute. Imagine standing behind that curtain seconds before the music hits. The isolation of that moment is crushing. You have spent months in rehabilitation, training in secret gyms at 4 a.m. to avoid being seen. You have lied to your friends. You have lied to your family. You have missed birthdays and weddings, all to preserve this one singular second of surprise. The returning star, let's call her the phantom of this opera, had to carry the weight of her own legacy. In her mind, the doubt must have been deafening. Will they remember me? Will they care? Can I still go at this level? 2025 is a different landscape than when she left. The athletes are faster, the hits are harder, and the fans are more fickle. To return is to risk tarnishing the memory of who you used to be. Every legend knows the saying, you can't go home again. But she was trying to defy that. She stood in the dark, waiting for her cue. She wasn't just fighting an opponent. She was fighting the ghost of her younger self. She was fighting the expectation of perfection. The deadly attitude the fans saw on screen was likely a shield, a mechanism to protect herself from the terrifying vulnerability of stepping back into the spotlight. That stoic face wasn't just a character choice. It was the only way to keep from breaking down under the pressure of millions of eyes. It was the armor necessary to survive her own myth. The story of a return isn't just told in the ring. It's told in the living rooms of the people who love the performer. While the world cheered, a small group of people watched with a knot in their stomachs. Her family.
Ow.
They know the cost of the bumps. They know the surgeries. They know the mornings where she can't get out of bed without groaning. To the fans, she is a superhero. To her family, she is a mortal woman who is risking her long-term health for the applause of strangers. Watching the return from home, her partner or parents likely felt a mix of immense pride and terrifying dread. They saw the futuristic gear and didn't see a cool costume. They saw extra padding to protect a surgically repaired neck or a bad back. They saw the deadly attitude and recognized the exhaustion behind the eyes. This emotional aftermath is rarely discussed. The sacrifice of a return is a family affair. Every time she takes a slam, they flinch. The joy of the fans is purchased with the anxiety of the family. As the crowd in the arena chanted her name, her family was likely silent, just hoping she would make it through the segment safely. They know that the adrenaline will fade, the lights will go off, and she will come home aching and bruised. This unseen narrative adds a layer of tragedy to the triumph. The wrestlers give us their bodies, but their families give us their peace of mind. It is a debt the audience can never truly repay, and it is the shadow that looms over every bright spotlight. The following weeks on television were a study in tension. She didn't wrestle immediately. She didn't cut long explaining promos. She simply existed in the space, a gravitational black hole that pulled every storyline toward her. The young up-and-comers, who had been calling themselves the future, suddenly looked like children pretending to be adults. The veterans who thought their spots were safe began to panic. The hierarchy of the WWE in 2025 didn't just bend, it broke. Every segment she was in carried a sense of impending violence. She would stand on the ramp, watching matches, taking notes. It was psychological warfare. The champions began to wrestle differently, more aggressively, more desperately trying to prove they belonged in the same ring as her. She forced the entire roster to level up without throwing a single punch. This is the mark of a true icon. Their presence alone elevates the product. The ratings spiked, not just for her segments, but for the whole show, because everyone wanted to see who would fall victim to her first. The deadly attitude became infectious. The smiles disappeared from the locker room. The show became grittier, more intense, more competitive. She had brought the storm with her, and everyone had to learn to swim in rough waters or drown. The era of happy to be here was over. The era of the apex predator had begun. The fans realized that this wasn't just a cameo. This was a hostile takeover. She was systematically dismantling the current generation to rebuild the industry in her own cold image. But here lies the twist. The true depth of this story wasn't about championships or dominance. As the months rolled on, and the storyline reached its fever pitch at WrestleMania, The truth began to bleed through. She hadn't returned to reclaim the belt. She hadn't returned to feed her ego. In a moment of quiet clarity, perhaps after a grueling match where she finally stood victorious, the mask slipped. She took the microphone, breathing heavy, sweat dripping onto the futuristic armor that had defined her new persona. She looked at her opponent, the young champion she had been tormenting for months. She helped her up. The crowd went silent. She didn't want the title. She wanted to know if the future was safe. She returned to be the ultimate test, the final boss that this new generation had to defeat to truly become legends. The deadly attitude was a crucible. She had to be the villain, the monster, the insurmountable wall, so that when someone finally climbed over her, they would be ready to carry the company for the next 10 years. She didn't come back to stay. She came back to say goodbye properly. She came back to pass the torch, not with a handshake but with a war, because she knew that respect is earned in blood and sweat, not given. The most unexpected return of 2025 wasn't a revival. It was a graduation ceremony disguised as a fight. And as she faded back into the darkness, leaving the spotlight to the next star, the fans finally understood. The magic wasn't that she came back. It was that she loved the business enough to make sure it would survive without her.